What actually is a Viking sword? Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria, and here we're going to be talking about Viking swords. What actually is a Viking sword? This really bugs me beyond rhyme or reason. I can't explain why it bothers me so much, but it's the fact that these sorts of swords, and we'll talk more about these specific examples in a minute, are so often described in the media, even amongst sword people, sword aficionados, sword fans, people into history, TV shows, historical movies, role-playing games, all that kind of stuff. These get described as Viking swords, and that really bugs me. Why does it bug me, I hear you ask? Well, quite simply, because most of these weren't Viking swords. Who did use these? Where were these made? What were these swords if they weren't Viking swords? And what actually is a Viking? But if you love Viking weapons and Viking history, you're going to absolutely love Vikings War of Clans. Vikings War of Clans combines the best of an MMORPG with the best of a strategy game to give you a real challenge. You can design your kingdom exactly how you like it. You can see what I've been doing here, building farms and mines and logging and everything. And when you've got the resources, you can raise a mighty army. And if we look in my barracks here, you can see that I have been training lots of mercenaries, horsemen and archers. And you can be a true Viking because as well as building up your civilization, you can go out and raid other people's and steal their stuff. Become a conqueror. So August is a great month to get playing. There's lots of news. On August the 10th, it's the 7th anniversary, which means there's a bunch of special events and prizes to win. August 19th to 20th, there's the Battle for the Throne. Throughout the month, there's also personal and clan blitz tournaments every 2 days. And every Tuesday and Wednesday during the month, learning, construction, research and training speed will increase by 20%. So Vikings War of Clans is absolutely free to download and play. You can download it using my QR code on screen or the link down below in the description there, and you're going to get all of these amazing awards. So now let's get back to the question of Viking swords. What is and what isn't a Viking sword? Well, I'm not going to beat around the bush here. The first thing to look at is what is a Viking. Okay, now we could have long debates about this, and there are many videos devoted to this very subject, some of them by me, it has to be said. But the fact is that a Viking, for the purposes of this video, we actually what most people mean when they say Viking is a Scandinavian. Okay, so they're talking about someone from one of the countries where Vikings sprung forth. Okay, so we're principally talking about Norway, Sweden and Denmark, to a lesser extent Finland and Iceland as well. But for the most part, certainly from a sort of Western European point of view and Eastern European point of view, we're talking about Norway, Sweden and Denmark. Now, in a country like England or France, for example, the majority of what we now call Vikings actually in period weren't known as Vikings. They were known as either Danes or Norse. Now, confusingly, many times the sources in the period refer to these people as Danes when they weren't necessarily Danes. Danes became a generic term from people from over there who are not Christian, and they keep coming and stealing things from our monasteries. But many of them came from Norway. So in England and France, the majority of what we now call Vikings came from Norway and Denmark. Some from Sweden, but predominantly the Swedish Vikings seem to have gone eastward and, of course, established some of the Viking cities that became now Russian cities in Russia today, and the Rus, for example. So they are the people that we're talking about. Now, the basic fact that I want to highlight here is that the majority of swords that we have surviving from this period weren't inherently Viking or Scandinavian or Norse swords. What do I mean by that? Well, quite simply, they might come from, we might find examples in Scandinavia. I'll talk a little bit more about this in a second. We might find examples in Scandinavia, but it doesn't mean they originated in Scandinavia. Okay, I'll come back to that point in a second. But more specifically, a lot of these style of swords, let's put one down for a minute, a lot of these style of swords that are characterized by a short crossguard and this type of kind of I-shaped, capital I-shaped hilt are common. This basic generic setup is common to swords across Europe in this time. So if you go to Francia, the land of the Franks, what we'd generically call France these days, then what types of swords were they using there under Charlemagne? Ones like this. If you went to Anglo-Saxon England in the 8th, 9th, 10th centuries, what sorts of swords were they using there? Ones like this. If you went to what's now Germany, the various German states that obviously unified in the 19th century and became Germany, but if you go to what we now call Germany in, again, the 8th, 9th, 10th century, what kind of swords were they using there? Swords like this. If you go all the way down to the land of the Longobards, the northern Italy, the lands that Charlemagne ended up ruling over, in fact, the lands above the Papal States, what kind of swords did they use there? Swords like these. Well, what about if you go all the way over to the west and go to Spain and Portugal, which at the time, a lot of that land was actually ruled over by the Moors, but there were certainly the kingdoms which later came into the Reconquista and fought against the Moors and drove them out. Those Christian kingdoms, what sort of swords were they using? Ones like these. So, what makes these Viking swords? Well, not very much. However, we can say that there were swords made in and styled by Scandinavians, the Norse, the Danes, what we'd now call Norwegians, Swedish, Danish and Finnish as well. And those swords we could call Viking swords. So what I'm not saying is that this isn't Matt Easton says Viking swords didn't exist. We can say Viking swords existed, but the really important part that I want you to take away from this video, and that's why I've just gone straight in and attacked it, is that most of these swords that you see in museums and replicated, like this very one in my hand from Albion, the Clontarf, are not per se Viking swords. So, what defines, according to me, a Viking sword? Notice I'm not saying Viking era sword. A Viking era sword I wouldn't have a problem with. What defines a Viking sword? Well, I would argue it has to be a style of sword that seems to inherently stem from and come from one of the lands where the Vikings came from. Norway, Sweden, Denmark and Finland. Now, if I pick up this sword for a second, this is an interesting style of sword. I'm not going to go into Peterson's typologies or anything that detailed in this video, but the book that I would absolutely recommend you get if you're interested in learning more about this is Swords of the Viking Age by Ian Pearce, and we'll look inside this book in a second. That is the kind of Bible for Viking swords, Viking era swords. Oh, I fell into my own trap there. But this style of sword is, by most people, I won't say universally because it's by about 90% of people who I'm aware of, is regarded as an Anglo-Saxon style. This particular style of sword, yes, you do find them in Scandinavia, and I'll come back to that point in a second, but bear that in mind. Yes, you do find them in Scandinavia, but you also find them all over England, and you see them in English art, Anglo-Saxon art. And it seems fairly clear to most people that study this topic, although there are some dissenters to this theory, that this is an Anglo-Saxon style of sword. So, why is it that you find them in Norway? Well, there's 2 points there, so I'm going to unpack this. First of all, you have to bear in mind that the Vikings were Vikings, okay? So they took a lot of things from other places and took them back to their homelands. Okay, so the Norse, they raided northern England, they raided what's now Normandy, they raided all the way to Spain, they traded down to the Byzantium, not just raiding, of course, trading as well. Okay, so I'm not going to get into a debate about were they traders or raiders, or were they murderers, were they whatever, were they good or bad? We're not going to get into that. The fact is that by many, many different mechanisms, a lot of things from other parts of Europe ended up in Scandinavia, number one. Okay, so absolutely simple explanation for how English swords should end up in Norway, either by war or by trade. Okay. The second fact is, and there are other things from those lands that end up there as well, things like silk, ecclesiastical objects, crosses and things like that, jewellery from all over, not just Europe, in fact, beyond that, silk, we know things were traded from India all the way across to Scandinavia at the time, including steel using Ulfbutt swords as well, incidentally. But secondly, we have survival bias, or survival bias, depending how you want to phrase it. Okay, what do I mean by that? Well, quite simply, the Scandinavians at this time, up until the end of the Viking era really, the majority of them, not all, some of them converted to Christianity, but the majority of them were pagan. What that meant was they followed burial practices which everyone else in Europe had abandoned, okay? So if we go back into the migration era after the fall of the Roman Empire, we've got people like the Angles, the Jutes and the Sacs, the Franks, the Longobards, the Alemanni, the Goths, Visigoths, Ostrogoths, all of these different groups of people, and something that they had in common is they tended to bury their dead with artifacts. That is, they put things in their grave for the afterlife. So your loved one, when you bury them, you put the sword in the grave, you put the spear in the shield, the jewellery, you put a drinking vessel, you put some food and some drink, maybe kill some animals, maybe kill a slave, maybe kill 50 slaves, depending on how important the person is you're burying. Sometimes put a ship over the top of them, like at Sutton Hoo. So the fact is that in the pagan era for most of Europe, this is what was done. Okay, burial goods were put in graves, which is, hooray, is fantastic for archaeologists, because that's why we know so much about migration era material culture, arms and armour and jewellery and clothes and all of these things, okay, because they were put in graves. However, as these various peoples were converted to Christianity, they stopped doing that. They stopped putting things in the grave because the Pope and the other Christian leaders said, no, we don't do that, because they don't have the same beliefs about the afterlife as the pagan people did, the people who worshipped Woden and Odin and all of the other pagan gods and goddesses. So they stopped putting burial goods in their graves, which means that we know a lot about Anglo-Saxon jewellery, for example, all the way up to the point at which they converted to Christianity, and then we have less goods to go on. We know far less about high-status Anglo-Saxon jewellery after the Christian period because there's not so much of it in the ground, okay? Now, in Scandinavia, they kept putting things in graves, they kept putting them into rivers as sort of holy deposits and all of this type of stuff. So fundamentally, we have a very large segment, we have a very large data set of swords for this period come from Scandinavia. So, for example, if we go back to the English style sword, it might be that statistically, this English style sword, if we just for the purposes of this video say categorically yes, this is an Anglo-Saxon style of sword. If there are, let's say, 200 of these surviving, okay, let's say there's 200 of these surviving, and of those 200, 150 of them have been found in Norway and Denmark, and 50 of them have been found in England. Someone, and some people do, say, well, if 150 are from Scandinavia and 50 are found in England, well then surely it's a Scandinavian style of sword, because most of them have been found in Scandinavia. Oh no, because how many swords have been found in Scandinavia compared to England? Quite simply, not that many swords have been found in England because they weren't being put in graves. There's other conditions as well to do with the weather and stuff like that as well. There's certain reasons why things survive in the ground in Scandinavia when they don't often in warmer countries, but additionally, or less waterlogged countries, and additionally there's this whole thing about religion and grave good traditions. So we know if we have 200 of these swords and 50 of them are from England, that probably shows us that it's an English style of sword. However, there is a counter argument. You could say, well, we know that the Vikings were very active in England. What's to say that these weren't Vikings bringing their swords to England and either selling them to Anglo-Saxons or being defeated in war and the Anglo-Saxons taking them? Because in history, actually, the victories and defeats of Viking armies in England are about 50-50, okay? Don't for a second think that the majority of battles were won by Vikings. The fact is that Vikings avoided battle and they raided a lot, but actually pitched battles, if you look at the statistics, the Anglo-Saxons won as many of them as the Vikings did, okay, more or less. So goods could go either way through conquest and through war, but quite simply because of survival bias and data sets and the statistics involved, I would argue this is an English style of sword. So there's the other elephant in the room as well. If all of these Viking era swords, if they were all Scandinavian styles, and we know they're not from the artistic styles on them as well, this particular example I'll talk about in a second, if they were all Viking swords, if they were all Scandinavian swords, where are all the English and Frankish swords? You've got to bear in mind the population sizes. I mean, you look at the size of Norway or Denmark and compare it to the size of England or France. The simple fact is there were a lot more Anglo-Saxons and Franks at this time. They were much bigger countries, much more populous, and we know they were producing swords. So if these swords are all Viking swords, then where are all the Frankish and English swords? So statistically, we know that, based on logic, a greater number of these swords are going to be either Frankish or Anglo-Saxon. Right, now we come to this sword. So this was found in Ireland, and it is widely described as a Viking sword. However, people who study, and this is a replica, but people who study the style of this sword and look at the artistic style there, that is not at all Norse. That's Frankish. Okay, so it's pretty much known that the sword that this is based on, the Clontarf, is essentially based on a Frankish sword that could be from what's now France, it could be from what's now Germany, or it could be from one of the countries that's areas that's now in between, like Belgium or Netherlands. But fundamentally, it's a Frankish style sword. So once we start to extrapolate this, we start to get, okay, we've got Anglo-Saxon style swords, we've got Frankish style swords, many of which are found in Scandinavia. So is it that there weren't actually any Viking swords? Is it that the Scandinavians simply bought or stole or conquered swords and weapons from other areas, and they just ended up burying them in Scandinavia because they brought them back as booty and loot? And bear in mind, as I mentioned, we do have a huge amount of jewellery, coinage. The biggest amount of Anglo-Saxon coins that survive in the world, I believe, certainly from this era anyway, have been found in Scandinavia because, of course, the Norse and the Danes were looting the mints and the banks essentially of Anglo-Saxon England and taking all the silver and gold back to Scandinavia, back to their homeland. This is what they did a lot of the time when they were raiding. So this stuff hasn't survived in England, but it has survived in Scandinavia. Now, if we come back to Ian Pearce's book for a second, before I wrap this up, as evidence of this point. So is it that all of the swords that are found in Scandinavia, is it that they all actually come from what's now France, Germany, England, potentially Spain, northern Italy? No. Okay, there are Viking swords. So as I said previously, this isn't me saying there are no Viking swords. There are Viking, i.e. Scandinavian, Norse, Danish swords. But disentangling them, this is the tricky part, and I'm not going to give you any definitive guides here, but disentangling which are definitely Scandinavian swords from which are Frankish or English or German swords is not easy for a number of reasons. Firstly, there's all of the things I've mentioned in this video. Okay, it's very difficult to tell whether the swords survive in numbers in Scandinavia simply because they were made there, because they were native to there, or because they were taken back there as booty or by trade. We don't know that, okay? We can only use common sense and look at the statistics available. So is there a type of sword which shows up a lot in somewhere like Sweden or Finland that doesn't show up in what's now France or what's now England? Yes, there are some, but there are also some types of sword which appear in what's now Scandinavia that also appear in fairly large numbers in the rest of Europe. Now, in those cases, it might be that some of those swords were made in Scandinavia, but to a generically European style. It could be that there were some swords being made in Scandinavia to a Frankish style or to an English style. We can't always tell where something was made, unfortunately. So there's that side of it. Equally, there is the fact that sometimes fashion is universal. Sometimes someone in London wears the exact same shirt as someone in Milan, and that shirt might have been made in America, okay? So sometimes fashions go across borders. So there might be a Viking warrior living in Norway, in Oslo, who by personal preference likes the exact same style of sword as a Irish chieftain living in Dublin, okay? Although Dublin at that time was ruled over by the Norse, so it's not a good example. Let's say somewhere else, somewhere in, Bristol in England, an Anglo-Saxon in Bristol in England. But you get the basic point. Sometimes you can have a style of sword that goes across areas. So I'm just going to pull out a few examples pretty much at random from here, okay? So first up, we have an example here, which is a single-edged sword, a shortish blade, and this that's an actually clearer example just there, but you can see this conical style of pommel. I won't, as I say, I won't go into the typologies and everything in this video, but that conical style of pommel, which you can see this also has here, and that's a single-edged blade. Now that, interestingly, was found in Ireland, but when we look at the statistics and the balance of where these swords appear, these single-edged swords with that style hilt are very commonly found in Norway. Now, what's Norway got in common with Dublin and Ireland? Well, as I mentioned a second ago, Dublin was ruled over by the Norse. So it's quite likely that this is actually a Norwegian sword. Now, again, it's not 100% certain, but on balance of probability, it seems like this is probably a Norwegian sword that has ended up in Dublin through either trade or war as a result of interchange, cultural interchange, shall we say, between the people of Dublin and the people of Norway at this time. Let's go to a different style sword here. This has actually been reproduced, but this style of hilt with this decoration with all these little dots, I hope you can see that clearly on there. That is a style which is found extensively in Scandinavia, but is not found hugely outside of Scandinavia. There is no real evidence pointing to the fact that this might be Frankish or English or German. It's very likely, and they might have imported blades, and this is the other element to it. We can't always identify a sword from its hilt. Sometimes it might be made of parts from different places, but that seems to be a Scandinavian style. I'll pull out a different one at random. Right, here we actually have the sword from Ballinderry that the Albion that I showed here is based on. And that was found in a drainage ditch in Ballinderry in Ireland. And that is widely regarded by most people I know as a Frankish style sword because it has parallels in France. There's a better picture of the hilt there. It has parallels in France, and additionally the style of vines essentially on the pommel and the crossguard are far more typical of Frankish art than they are of anything in Scandinavia at that time. And I'll pull up, one more example here. So here's another example of one of those English style swords with the curving crossguard, the curving pommel. These are found all over the place in England. There's some very famous and high status examples found in England, but you also find them in Scandinavia. It seems, because of the number of them found in England, that they are probably an English style. They're also shown in English art of the period. So it's probable that this is an English sword, and a lot of them found their way to Norway. However, you could legitimately argue that maybe they were being made in both places. Maybe there was cross-pollination of ideas. And another nice example, this type, which is not often reproduced, which is simply like a capital I, just with a bar for a pommel and nothing more, they are found all over Europe. Okay, so that's kind of a pan-European style. However, as far as I'm aware, it seems to have stayed in fashion for longer in Scandinavia. So it does seem that more of these, if we go into like the 10th century, for example, the 900s, it does seem that more of these survive in Scandinavia than anywhere else. And so it seems that whilst this is a pan-European style, it seems like it may have stayed in fashion for longer in Scandinavia. So I hope that's been somewhat thought-provoking. Yes, it does bug me when people refer to all of these things as Viking swords, when in fact this is probably an English sword and this is probably a Frankish sword. They're just from the Viking era. However, admittedly, either of these could have ended up in a Viking grave. Either of them could have been used by a Viking. But I really wish people would refer to them as Viking era swords or early medieval swords or something. I don't know, some other name, just not Viking swords, because they're not Viking swords. It's a far, far more complex topic than that. Thanks a lot for watching. Thanks again to the sponsors for this video. Check out that link below, and I'll see you back on the channel really soon for another video. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.